we're surrounded by it all the time, but we don't see it because we're not willing to see it, right? We avoid it. And that which we avoid, we create a very strong relationship to, that which you're trying to turn away from. You are courting it, actually. It's in fact, it's in acceptance that we stop courting it. That we stop inviting it, because we're not rejecting it. We're just seeing it as what it is.
Action!
Welcome to the Spirit of Yoga. We are Kirsten
and Devdas
from the Akasha Yoga Academy. And today's community question and answers, we will explore the topic of karma and of death. So very, very interesting questions that came in. A follow-up on a podcast where we went into the topic of transmutation. And the first one, I love the question. I'm experiencing a last kiss, a karmic mind attack. What to do or what not to do? And are there any yogic practices that I can use to help me through that?
Wow, beautiful question, huh?
Maybe we start with tying back into what's last kiss. That's something that, a term that comes from you, from a previous conversation. Maybe we touch back into that. What's the last kiss?
Well, it was actually from your experience, but sometimes as we go through kind of this karmic shedding process, where we're letting go of some strong identity, we're in the process, then we even feel like we're very close to free or maybe totally free. And then this strong sense of that identity can come back. And I often call that the last kiss. It's very common that people in our course go through some variation of the last kiss, actually, where they're kind of dropping something or shedding something or letting go of something. And then they come and they say, oh, wow, it's like that identity is as strong as it ever was. And it feels like, yeah, but it's on its way out the door. But it wants to have one last pranam, one last acknowledgement. Hey, thank you. And then off it goes, and many times never to be seen again. And that's why it's the last kiss, right? It's the last appearance of that karmic pattern in our lives.
So what to do when I'm there? Like, it's overwhelming. Like, I was just sharing that rather recently, some work identification karma last kiss came up for me, meaning a full identification with that thing, with whatever process you're letting go of. And it's something that just doesn't stop, right? Kind of that it feels like there's, from the doing side of things, there's nothing to do about it. Like it's just a whirlwind of mental chatter. Like, I perceive it very mental. Maybe it can be also more emotional, mental, emotional, like in these two realms, that there's just such a strong play, outplay. And what do I do?
Yeah, it's a very beautiful, very interesting question. I feel like like my first response would be, if it really is the last kiss, one thing that can be helpful is just understanding that that's just a memory, actually. It's just a strong association that you've had with a past memory. And as memory, there's nothing binding about it. It's just a piece of memory like any other piece of memory. Like, to us, it can seem very strong, like, oh, I'm letting go of this intense thing. It's like, but what the sages would say about letting go of memory is, oftentimes, don't even look too much at the detail. Because it's like you're just letting go of this thing. If you sometimes if you look too deeply at it, you've given it an invitation to stick around, rather than, okay, take a half step back, relax, stay present. And I would even say it depends a little bit on like the type of yogi that's going through the experience, and also the depth of the experience itself. Like there would be times at which I would say a lot of practice would benefit, and then there would be times where I would say don't practice at all. Or if you have a practice, let it be something extremely simple. Lie down in shavasana, corpse pose. Okay, like, when I'm done with all my obligations in this life, when I'm at the absolute end of my experience of this life and I'm shedding even the physical body, will this association be so strongly powerful to me that it will continue to call me back? Or will I be free of that? It's likely that I will be free of that. If I'm free of that then, why wouldn't I be free of it right now? That's the yogic philosophy of life, right? It's like, rather take charge of your life and have that process of letting go be a shorter one rather than a longer one. And rather than hold these relationships out through time, it's like, no, I'm willing to make the radical step of letting go of these things as they come up in me, not forcing through it, but just like seeing, transcending, seeing, transcending, seeing, transcending. And there may be a point, like I said, there may be a point at which that can meet with a strong practice, a pranayama practice, a strong physical practice, meditation practice. Many times like rigorous sadhana helps us in that process. But there are also times at which rigorous sadhana hinders that practice. And I would say the wisdom to know inside of yourself what's going to facilitate that process. And that has to do on just looking like introspection, right? Like being able to look within and see. The other day, something seemingly very small happened karmically. I don't think it was a big event at all. It was actually rather a tiny event. But I could feel energetically that it threw something off inside, and there was like a strong sense of my heart rhythm and even my breath rhythm being outside of its normal range. And I had work to do, so I went to my office, and inside my office it was feeling like, okay, what's the work that I'm meant to be doing right now? And then I just lied down on the floor. It's like I'm meant to be just doing the work of shavasana right now. Just lie down on the floor. Okay, my heart's really pounding like very strongly, and my breath even also seems a bit out of control. So if I have any responsibility in this moment, let's let the responsibility be just let my breath come back to normal. Just let my heartbeat come back to normal. And in maybe 10, 15 minutes, it had regained its natural, relaxed expression. And then I stood up and started working again. Okay, the internal work is done. Now I can continue with life.
Yeah, I keep on practicing meditation, and I noticed under this last kiss mind attacks, karmic mind attacks, that the meditation practice is also influenced, and it is taking much longer, I feel, to touch base with a stable ground.
Yeah.
But I found it very, and sometimes surprisingly, not at all. So there's no clear rule about that, but it really helped me to just touch base with a stable ground regularly.
Yeah.
To know the stable ground, or to take the stable ground even as a memory into the next mind attack, so to speak.
This is like the most vitally important tool that you have as a yogi. Like recently, there was a woman on one of the calls who was basically expressing that she was going through something like a last kiss, and challenging situation in her life, a fluctuation in her life. And the very first question I posed to her was, do you feel that you've recognized the difference between the point inside of you which is stable and the point inside of you which is moving? And she said, yes. I said, okay. Like, you'll be fine.
Right.
Like, keep yourself in constant association with the stable. And there's many different ways for doing that. Meditation is, of course, a fantastic way. We were talking earlier about pranayama, which I feel like is also a fantastic way, but sometimes is not the right way when you're experiencing a mind attack, because it's like you're fanning the flame of the kind of karmic situation, especially with Manipura, with the kind of fire center. It's like you put more fire behind something that's already lit on fire. It's not necessarily a good thing. But hopefully, as you practice more and more, and you come more and more into a sense of where is that stability, or what's the methodology for myself that helps me to access that stability, the tools that you're working with. And then in those moments, okay, it's more strong. One thing I would definitely say is move towards whatever's going to put you in stability and not away. Because that can also be a tendency people have. Something happens like, oh, it's so strong, and then I'm just going to run away into like the things that I like to do in my life, or the diversions that occur to me. That, I would say, is the one thing to be very aware not to do. Right? It's like a strong thing comes. I'm not afraid to look at it. I'm just here with it. And maybe I even have to clear out my schedule and make more space to be with it. Because in that moment, it's harder for me to find the stability of the ground that I'm sitting in. And so, okay, but I make that my priority. I put that as the number one important thing in my life. Because transcending that karma, once you're free, you're free.
Yeah.
Right? It's like when you're free of something that's been plaguing you, it will not plague you anymore. You are free.
Yeah.
And, being able to establish those victories along the way. And maybe they're not my absolute karmic victory. I'm free from everything. But if one chunk is gone, wow, that's something worth celebrating, right? Like that's a beautiful victory of the soul on the soul's journey to freedom. And, that would be a right moment to celebrate in your heart, especially once you kind of pass through the fire period. When you've walked through the fire and you're on the other side, okay, gratitude to life, gratitude to the immense intelligence of life and life's wisdom for helping us engage in this process of freedom.
Yeah, another sentence that comes to my mind from a great teacher, he would say, stay put. So don't take any decisions right now. Don't make any tremendous changes out of this state of unclarity. Rather, trust that it's washing through, or kind of the fire will die down. And from this space, than rather meeting life and acting. To not take big decisions or change your life from the state of unclarity.
And once in my life, I got a fantastic piece of advice from a shopkeeper that I'd never met. I walked in the store and he looked at me and he said, the hottest part of the fire is right in the center, the white part. And I was thinking, like he was reading my mind, my experience. I was in that moment in a very fiery place of letting go of something. And then he said, that is the hottest part, but that is also the part that gives off the most light. And, it was just like, fully heard in my heart the message of that sharing. And I think it's experientially true, right? It's like when you've gone through some kind of fire and you've let go of something. You talked about it on the other podcast, right? So that feeling of groundedness, but also expansion and growth, and something is transcending and something is aware of that transcendence, and there's a celebration in the heart of that process.
Should we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
So the next question is, the conversation on transmutation and death changed my perspective on death. How can I support a close one to die in a transformative way?
Interesting one.
So we were talking about transmutation being an irreversible change in a way, changing from one state into really a different one, and there's no way back, which has death as an inherent part. So in the part of transmutation, death has a very important role. And question Devdas for you, I think. How can I help a close one? How can I help my parents? How can I help my partner in this process of transmutation, potential transmutation, of physically dying?
Yeah. It's a very intriguing question. I feel it's very alive in the heart of many yogis, or I hope it's alive in many yogis. And, I feel like the answer is maybe a little bit of a strange one, and it has many parts to it. So maybe we just start at the first part, which is it's very difficult to sit with someone through their own death process if you are not comfortable with your own death process. Like if you have not embraced the fact that one day you too will pass from this body, it's unlikely that you'll be able to really sit with someone through their own process, because it will bring up in you reactivity, right? It's like something inside you, that's gonna happen to me too. And I think that's why you see it in many cultures, definitely most Western cultures, really bad decisions being made amidst families when death comes to the door. Because rather than just see it as this is like something that we're all going through together and we support each other and love each other through this challenging process, you get people making very reactive decisions. And that reactive decision does not necessarily have to do with letting go of the loved one, although it can be from that. I think more often it's because we're afraid of our own process. And yet, and this is where the yogic standpoint comes in, death is just inherently part of life. And it's part of every part of life. Like the moment that you're born, there's only a certain number of breaths before you leave that body. Like that's true for everything and everyone. And all around us, all of nature is also embarking in that same cycle, right? It's like things are born, things pass. And everywhere around us, all of life is expressing something of both, right? The birth, the sustenance, the dissolution is all around us. And, from a yogic standpoint, like what you were saying about, okay, I have this last kiss experience and that karma's gone. And I awaken from that in a very grounded, rooted, content state. I would say the same thing is true of death, actually, from a yogic standpoint. When I've accepted the possibility that this physical body will no longer be here at one point, it opens up possibility, actually. And that possibility is profoundly, profoundly, profoundly beautiful. And, you know, but not possible until the point at which you're capable of sitting with somebody through that process. Like a story that I often tell, it's a funny story. My mother was entering some point of her life where she was no longer capable of living in a big house by herself anymore, and we needed to think about shifting her into some kind of different place for her living arrangements. And they were having a you know elder living conference, like all the different options for people who are elderly about where they can live and what condition and under what kind of support. And I saw it in the paper and I said, Mom, this is for us. Like, look at this. You don't have to choose anything. You just go and you see, what are my options? Maybe you don't like any of them. Great, no problem. But at least you know what the options are. We go together. And she was a bit reluctant, but then she said, okay, yeah, you're right. We go together. It was on a weekend, and there was tons and tons and tons of people there. I think there was probably 1,000 people there, looking at all the different options for what to do in housing. How many people there, younger generation, like myself, maybe let's say under 50 years old or under 40 years old, they're supporting their family? How many of 1,000? 2. Me and one other person. And it was very funny with the one other person. We walked past each other at one point. She looked at me and just almost started laughing. I looked at her and almost started laughing, like, okay, here we are, the two people that are, in support of our family through this process. But when I reflected, okay, 1,000 people here, only 2 family members supporting them in that process. Why is that way? That reflection brought me back to the reflection we were talking about earlier, right? It's like, you cannot help somebody through that process until you understand that process will also happen to you. And rather than that being something that you're terrified of, that's a natural expression of life. That's a natural expression of the profound intelligence of life. There's nothing to be avoided. There's nothing to be afraid of. It's a natural part of the life process. And, in India, it is a natural part of the life process. It is a seen part of the life process. Like when someone passes, they walk right through the center of town on a cot and down to the burning ghat. And then at the burning ghat, their body is, released back into the ether. And the family is like gathered around in that process and witnessing that process. And, in that way, I think overall as a society, there's much less fear of death, actually, because the process is seen. You've witnessed someone go through that transition. And I would rather back up from that and say, if you witness someone going through the last stage of their life, we have a tendency to think that's a blessing for the one who's dying. It is a blessing for the one that's living. To have been there through, like holding someone's hand through the most difficult journey, or one of the challenging journeys that someone will go on in this life. It is a privilege. It is not a burden. It is a privilege. And it can, I think the reason why it can sometimes not feel like that is because that can be a rather long transitional process for somebody. I think people think, I'm supporting my loved family member dying, it means I'm with them in the last moment of their life. No, it means that you're with them as they make that whole transit out into a new life. And that part can be really sticky, right? It's like I had the privilege of being there during that process for my own father. And, at some point, the capacity to interact in the way that we had interacted in the past was no longer present. It was, and there was no longer any kind of verbal exchange that needed to happen. It was like he was just there and I was just there. But I had this feeling, and we were doing things that would not interest me at all. We were kind of had the TV on, and we were sitting in his space and just being together. But it somehow felt vitally important, to my heart. It's okay, what's happening here? I don't really know what's happening here, but I know in my heart that I'm supposed to be here. And if you ask me from the outside perspective, from what it looks like, I'm just sitting here watching TV. It's nothing that I would choose to do with my life force and my life energy. But something felt it's vitally important that I'm here right now. I don't know why, but I just feel to be here. And then, as he transitioned, well, we should back up and say the first thing that allowed him his transition outside of the body was that his wife gave him permission to leave. And I feel like that happened more than what people would realize, right? It's like people are held by the people that they love, and they won't leave until there's a kind of energetic resolution sometimes. And literally my father's got more sick and 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 more sick. And at some point it was like, man, how are you hanging on to that body? That's incredible. And then his wife came to him one night, looked him in the eyes and said, I give you permission to go. Next morning he was gone. He was waiting for that permission. And when he crossed, and even maybe a little bit before he crossed, actually, it was so clear it's hard to put into words, but I felt him the way that he would have been when he was young. His spirit was so there, and the body was just not there. The body was just in a dire situation. But I felt so clear his heart and his essence and his being. And, if somebody's with you energetically through that process, that's transmutation, right? In his body, it was not any longer functioning, but something there was functioning, and sitting through that process with someone, that's being there for someone's rebirth in a way, right? It's like you've been with someone through the fire, if you will, of the process. And that takes a lot of, for lack of a better word, it takes some courage, to really be able to sit with someone through the most challenging, or one of the most challenging things that they'll experience in their lifetime. Yogis like to say death is the final exam, right? It's the point at which lots of things can be overcome, actually. And that was also my experience, definitely my experience with my father. I feel like he took major leaps in just the last moments um, of his life. And that's the radical potential of transmutation, right? That's the radical potential of rebirth. And that's why the yogis consider that to be such a auspicious transition, actually. A lot can be accomplished in that transition. And it's definitely helpful to have support and love around you. And even that, I feel, not always really understood, right? It's like it's more energetic support than verbal support. And not verbal support of the kind that we're used to. Hey, I love you, I'm going to miss you, tears, this kind of thing. It's more like, no, it's a kind of shamanic role, like you're witnessing somebody transit to a new form, or perhaps completely out of form. And, if there's a role in that, I think the role is holding space and just being profoundly present.
So basically, to break it back down to the question, how can I support someone close in the process of dying? On one hand, be comfortable with your own, or with the idea that we are dying ourselves. And I found also very interesting you saying his wife giving permission to leave. So of course there is naturally grief, I believe.
Yeah.
But energetically allowing the departure.
Yeah.
Rather than holding on, like you said, your dad was long time holding on to a falling apart body.
Yeah.
Because permission wasn't there to leave.
Yeah.
And as soon as it came, he went on. So being comfortable with our own, or with the idea of our own death and departure, and in a way accepting, embracing the departure of the loved one, right?
Yeah. And like from the yogic standpoint, I feel like that's it reaffirms your love. It doesn't destroy your love. It reaffirms your love. Like when I could feel my father's spirit, there was such a joy in that. It's just like, wow, what a beautiful being. And am I going to miss him? Yeah, of course. But that's not the primary thing on the table. Like the primary thing on the table is his transmutation and process of transitioning into something new. And, can I support him through that process? Yeah, of course. Like, that's all yogis are doing. Like we talked about in the previous podcast, like every breath, every day is a kind of a death and a preparation for death. And, it's, if there's anybody out there that's particularly struggling with that idea, in the Vairagya Bhairava Tantra, one of the practices, right? Before you go to bed, sit down. Divest yourself of every relationship. Divest means just unassociate yourself with every relationship. Go through every part of your memory. That's not me. That's not me. I'm unassociated from that. That's just memory. Let go of every single thing until there's nothing left. Then you're sitting with nothing. You're acknowledging nothing is here. No association. I don't have any kind of association left. Then lie back down and sleep. You're already in the deep sleep state. Because in the deep sleep state, there's no association. Like, you've started out that process. Even you can, if you want to take it even to the real step, that it's actually written in the scripture. Accept in that moment. That's it. That's the end. Nothing else is coming. It's the end of my life. I'm just here. I don't know what's going to happen, but here I am. Back into deep sleep. That is a profoundly practical methodology for overcoming karma. Profoundly practical. You know, when I read that, I felt, and this is the story of Ramana also, right?
Yeah.
And Ramana had not been, Ramana Maharishi was the great sage who brought Jnana Yoga and the question of who am I and all of the process of self-inquiry back into the world, back because it had already been practiced before, but he made it popularized it again, let's say. And he didn't have any practice, but he was seized profoundly. And he must have practiced it in another lifetime. I bet in another lifetime he was practicing just what I said. Every night he was divesting himself of all his association, then falling back into sleep. And then when he was, I think, very young, 16 or 18, he just had the feeling, oh, I'm going to die. And it was so profound in him that he lied himself down on the ground so that when his relatives came, they would be easily able to carry him to the burning ghat. It was that much that he felt, okay, no, this is it, you know. And he lied down on the ground. Okay, this is the end, here I am. And then suddenly, the end of what? It's only the end of my memory association. It's only the end of my personality, my body. That's not me. And in that moment, he was totally free. And he lived out, of course, the entire rest of his life in that freedom. He just had freed himself completely from that identification with the karmic memory that compels action. He was free from all that in just one moment. And, you know, that can seem, I think, in the modern world, like that kind of practice can seem, that's morbid. It's like, or I'm courting death, or I'm inviting death in some way. It's not inviting death, it's recognizing that part of life, which is constantly there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's there also in the animal kingdom, it's there also in the plant kingdom, it's there also, so we're surrounded by it all the time, but we don't see it because we're not willing to see it, right? We avoid it. And that which we avoid, we create a very strong relationship to, you know, that which you're trying to turn away from. You are courting it, actually. It's in fact, it's in acceptance that we stop courting it. You know, that we stop inviting it, because we're not rejecting it. We're just seeing it as what it is. That's the real definition of yoga, right? It's like not seeing life according to the overlays of the memories of the past and our association of the memories of the past, but life for what life is. And life for what life is includes also this process of transmutation.
So we are, I feel, touching already into the next question, our own death. So not the support of a loved one, but our own death. And the question is, what are the yogic recommendations on how to die?
That's an interesting and more practical question, isn't it?
Absolutely. Like I felt as I was about to give birth naturally at home. For some reason, I think it's arrogance. um, I felt I would just naturally tap into the intuition how to birth. And probably many of us also walk through life that they simply naturally tap into the intuition how to die. Um, Giving birth, I was completely unprepared, I would say, overwhelmed, and not able to tap into that really. So I felt that was a mistake. And that's a mistake that I shouldn't repeat
Yeah.
when dying.
Yeah.
So I guess that's valid for many of us, for
Yeah.
all of us.
Yeah.
In fact, for all of us,
Yeah.
because it is inevitable for everyone.
But you know what you've shared is so profoundly beautiful. Like I think there's sometimes this idea in our mind. It's like the test is coming. I'm gonna ace the test. It's like, but you never even studied for it. Like what
I
are the
feel the
chances?
challenge is just so big, or kind of the knowingness. For me, it was the knowingness. It will be just such a big process.
Yeah.
Like it felt such an overwhelming challenge in a way that I was almost giving up. How could I prepare for that? Like how like it's too big for being prepared for that in a way.
Right.
And probably it is if you take it personal, right?
Yeah.
If we approach it personal life,
Yeah.
giving birth, dying is just too big
Yeah.
for our mind to wrap itself around and to be in charge of it.
Yeah. That's unquestionable. I feel like and that's why in the Western world, where there's so much emphasis on the importance of the mind and the validity of the mind, so many bad decisions come around death. Because if you approach it from the standpoint of the mind, it will be an absolute disaster. Like it will be full of reactivity. It will be full of bad decisions. It will be full of miscommunication and just bad decision making.
Yeah.
Because it's not being seen from the place of what's actually happening. It's being seen from my own reactive process and all of the different things that are piled up in my karmic warehouse. And that allows for a bunch of misinterpretations.
So what does yoga say? What's the yogic recommendations on dying?
I mean, I feel like it might be useful here to reflect on what's the mind's kind of like version of a good death, and what's the yogic explanation of a good death. Because the mind often has this thing of the good death being, okay, I'm surrounded by loved ones, I'm surrounded by people who care for me, I've got pictures of everybody I love on my wall. And from a yogic standpoint, that's not necessarily actually a good death, right? It's like a good death from a yogic standpoint is like, well, almost everything in life from the yogic standpoint is not a question of what happens. And that's a big misunderstanding in the world. It's like, what's going to happen? No, not what's going to happen. How conscious are you of what's happening? Right? Where are you in that process? What happens, it's not that important. Probably in your next lifetime, you don't remember any of it. And yet you think each piece of it is so important. But what's important is being conscious of each piece of it as it unfolds. And that I feel like is even more true as we get toward the final transition, right? It's like it's not so much a question of what are the conditions, what are the outward conditions of the transiting experience, but that we're conscious of that experience. And previously in the exercise from the Tantra scriptures, if you've practiced, that's going to be better, right? Like you're going to go through that process more consciously. If you've been engaged in that process and working with that process and experimenting with that process, and I think sometimes one of the great modern yogis put it in a really funny way. He said, when your time comes, all of your appointments will have to be canceled. And that seems kind of like almost a little bit superficial. But then if you actually somehow translate that into experience, by contemplation, that's just what it's going to be like, right? It's like tomorrow you have 20 things on your agenda and, 20 things that you want to be doing. None of those things are going to happen. Is that okay? Like, are you in your heart clear? No more appointments. Gyananandaji, my teacher in India, used to say, no appointments, no disappointments. What does it mean? It means it's the end of the expression of this life, right? Like that's the final chapter of the book of this particular lifetime. And is that going to be a conscious life process? And many yogis, especially if they've really been working on the subtlety of their energetic bodies and other bodies, they know that the process is coming, actually. And then it's like, okay, is that then a more conscious process? Of course, it would have to be, right? If it's part of your conscious knowledge, it would have to be a more conscious process. And that's what they talk about with Mahasamadhi, right? The end of the life experience. There was a guru in Italy, and he was quite a quirky character, and a lot of people had some strong opinions that some people thought he was really enlightened, some people thought he wasn't enlightened. There was a lot of controversy around this character. And he took all of his students on a pilgrimage to Kailash, to the holy mountain in India. And they got up above the tree line, and it's really hard to breathe. You really have to reduce your luggage because everything that you're carrying is crazy heavy. And you're basically doing an extreme mountain climbing event. It's a spiritual progress, but it's also an extreme event with lots of things happening. And he tells all of his students, you have to carry this much firewood, like to the up above the tree line. Like there's no more trees, but you need to carry this much firewood. And they were good students, so they said, okay, we carry this firewood. So he goes up one more height, and leaves the body. And they have exactly enough firewood to cremate his body. It's like he knew exactly what was happening, even to the extent at which he had his students carrying up what they needed to take care of the remains of his physical body. It's like, now that can seem like, whoa, but no, not whoa. Like, that's conscious exit,
Yeah.
He knew what was coming. He prepared for it accordingly. And, I'm sure he consciously left his body also, right? I don't think he left his body because it was no longer a suitable instrument or it had been smashed or anything else other than that. It was his moment. He left. And that was the end of that particular life process. Some of you know the great soul Yogananda, who wrote this book, Autobiography of a Yogi. he consciously left his body too. And he left in the most intriguing way. He was actually at a conference. He was giving a yoga conference. And he was speaking one of the poems that he'd written in his life, which was about India. And the last line of that poem, I think it's something, this might not be exact, but it's something like, where yogis, mystic, and saints tread that soil, I am blessed. My body touched that sod. Gone. Just like his reverence for India, his last word, I am blessed. My body touched that sod. Gone from the body. And so, I feel like these great ones like this come to be the living example for us of how to make that final transit, right? Give us an example of what does it mean. And maybe our exit from this body is completely conscious. We know it's coming. We exit a certain way. Maybe it's a step down from that. We just have an intuitive feeling that it's our time. Maybe we slowly reduce what we eat. And, we begin to feel this transition, and we accept that transition and embrace whatever unfolds in that process. But no matter which end of the yogic spectrum that is happening on, it's happening with conscious awareness, right? Of the actual process that's happening, which is just that you've let go of the physical body, right? It's that's the misconception of the modern world. It's like if you're wholly identified with your mind will never be the same mind again. Devdas isn't coming back again as Devdas. Like, if there's something to become back, it will come back as something else, right? Some other opportunities for the soul's growth. But it will never be the same again. And in that way, if there's a strong belief, okay, what I am is my mind, and it is never coming back again. Yes, that's true. That's true. It's never coming back again the way it was. So if there's attachment to the way it was, that will not be an easy transit, right? Like, to be expected to let go of all of that karmic storehouse of memory in one moment, it is possible, but it's rather unlikely. Better that you've been working at that process before the time comes. And, in general, in yoga, I think they would say, once you cross 50, you're starting to work with letting go of the karmic burden. Hopefully you're working at it before that. But in the stages of life process, vanaprashta and sannyas are the last two stages of life. There's differing traditions on what people say when vanaprashta happens, but most yogis would say it happens sometime around 50, let's say 50 to 60 or 48 to 60, let's say, would be a safe gauge. And that's the process by which you start letting go of all the identification. You remove yourself from the work world in the same way that you were before. You start to do service without any expectation of anything in return. You're purifying your energetic centers. You're purifying your vibrational experience. You're beginning your withdrawal, and then sannyas at the end of life. Really, you're completely withdrawn. There's no longer any relationship activity. There's no longer any family activity, or very minimal. And you're beginning really the process of actually transiting out of the situation. So that's built in to the idea of a good yogic life is a good yogic death, right? That it's part of the life process and part of the life experience.
Yeah, three very
Intense questions.
intense questions, intensely relevant.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad that we had the opportunity to look into karma and specifically death. Thank you so much for your sharing, Devdas.
Thank you. And thank you guys all out in our community for these beautiful questions. I feel like they're not easy questions, but they're essential questions in the yoga process, right? I mean, the yogis of old used to go sit in the cremation ground.
Yeah.
Just like, okay, that's going to happen to me too. Am I prepared for that in body and mind and spirit? Am I okay with the notion that, because that is inevitable, right? That is an inevitable part of the process. There's a funny moment in the scriptures where there's two sages walking next to each other, and the other, one sage says to the other, "What's the greatest miracle of life? What's the greatest illusion of Maya?" And the sage smiles and he says, "That death will happen to every single human being, but nobody thinks it will happen to them." And that's that's the condition, isn't it? It's happening all around us. It's happening as we speak.
Yeah.
It's part of the life process, but somehow we many times aren't willing to really look. And the minute that you look, you see, wow, perhaps it's not as scary even as what I thought. Actually, it's rather a normal part of the life and the life experience.
Thank you for sharing. So this was Wisdom in Motion with the Akasha family. Keep shining in the spirit of yoga.